Hey there, it's Kat Kinsman, Executive Features Editor at Food & Wine, and this fall, we're launching the new Food & Wine Classic in Charleston with our partners at Southern Living and Travel + Leisure, and we want to see you there. Join us September 27th through the 29th to learn from iconic chefs, share a glass with innovative wine experts, and experience Charleston with one-of-a-kind events. Tickets are on sale now at foodandwine.com/Charleston Classic. That's foodandwine.com/Charleston Classic. See you down in Charleston.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Good morning, everybody. This is Amuse News. I'm your host, RJ. I am here with the guest, Steve Huffman. We're going to talk with Steve in just a second. All I want to say in introduction is that we are, as you probably heard if you've been listening to HRN Podcast, we are doing a really cool and interesting gala-style event here in Philadelphia on September 29th to raise money for our education programs. It's called A Feast for the Senses. We have two Best of Philly chefs. We have an awesome local musician, Aaron Magner, who's going to be providing the music. And it's going to be a four-course meal with beverage pairing, a set of music from Aaron Magner's Spaga, a conversation with led by Eli Culp of Delicious City Philly, who's a chef and podcaster from Philly. It's going to be a really cool night. So check out heritageradionetwork.org/feast. I'll put the link in the show notes. Thanks, Steve, for allowing me to do that quick promo before we start. How you doing?
Absolutely, RJ. Thank you. Are you in Philly right now? One of my favorite food cities, or so.
Yeah, I'm right outside of Philly. Yep, exactly.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would give anything to be going to Zahav for dinner this evening.
It's interesting. So we just went there for the first time. I've lived here for 5 years, and we just went for the first time last month. And
oh, my goodness.
It was all those restaurants are just what an experience.
What a place.
Yeah. And while we are here, for those watching or who watch this on video, to talk about Steve's book, A Season for That. Steve and I were just talking about how to kind of summarize this book. The subtitle is Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. But I found this book to be really engaging and interesting, kind of meditation, I guess, is maybe a little bit too philosophical of a word, but kind of a reflection on family, on food, on career, sort of a midlife kind of reflection. There's a lot of things here, and I have a lot of questions as a parent and as a middle-aged person. But Steve, tell us about how did this book come about?
It began with a trip that I took with our family, my wife and our two kids. The kids were 9 and 14. They had both taken French in school. They went to a French immersion school. I've been a French speaker most of my adult life. And so we went there mostly really just to put the kids in school, ended up staying for 6 months for an extended fall semester. And by the time we were done, I realized that something sort of extraordinary had happened while we were there. Not just that we had kind of through effort and a little bit of imagination found our way kind of into the heart of this place, but that the ground had sort of shifted under my feet as a middle-aged man and father and husband and food lover and wine lover, and so I knew that something had happened. I had just started to take up writing again. It was an early love that I had to abandon for much of the middle of my life to pay all the bills, and so I started trying to write this book. In the end, it took me 10 years. I had a facility for writing, pretty prose, but no experience or facility with sustaining a narrative. And I think it took those 10 years in part to learn how to write a book. It felt like, as I've said, it felt like kindergarten and graduate school at the same time. But I think it took that long for me to really actually understand what the story was about. And part of that was what you just mentioned, which is that it was about multiple overlapping elements of my life, not just a travelogue, which is fairly common of Americans in France. That's been done a lot. In this case, really, I left a changed person, and it happened because of who I married. It happened because of who my children are, but it also happened because of who we met there and what this place had to tell me.
Well, I mean, in terms of learning how to write a book, I think that you accomplished that. If I
you.
say so. One of the things I like as a parent, I love that you set yourself up to this as this like quixotic figure from the beginning, and you're like, the first scene in the book of you in the restaurant, for the first time, and in France with your kids, and I feel like any American who's been in another country as a tourist can relate to that. But it's kind of I feel like you set yourself up as the heel sort of throughout the book.
Yes.
But,
well, I think I started off as the heel to some extent, not exaggeratedly so, but subtly so, which is a guy who was still in some sense tied up in his own young man's ego. And, I was trying to recreate an experience from earlier in my life where I went to Paris. I was a suburban kid from Minnesota. I kind of found myself. I was suddenly this sophisticated cigarette smoking dude strutting the streets of Paris in a world capital and feeling like a citizen of the world. And a lot of my adult life, I had tried, at least our experiences in France after I was married, was me trying to recreate that experience, which was really a form of performance, not a form of participation, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so arriving here and thinking this is just going to be business as usual, and Steve's going to speak pretty French, and everybody's going to applaud as he walks the streets. That's an exaggerated way of saying it, but there was a certain element of that when I arrived. And so to say that I was the villain is not entirely wrong. I was still too taken up with myself. I couldn't get over myself, and there was a lot of humbling that had to be done over the course of the story for me to learn the lesson that this experience was ready to teach me.
That's a good way of putting it. And I think you have the what's interesting to me as a kind of an avid reader is like you have the personal journey, but then there's intertwined, in almost every page, and definitely in every section, every like subsection, there's food, and there's descriptions of food, there's descriptions of meals, there's descriptions of like what you're finding in the market and the seafood, and really like vivid kind of tales, but it's not really about, food is like a character in the story, the food.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're in Mediterranean France or in France generally, food is going to play a part. I think if you're going to take France on its terms, to some extent, you need to wrestle with food and wine. But I think in this particular case, for one thing, I tried to make it funny, which I think is important because earnest French memoirs, nobody needs any more of those ever. I hit middle age. My life wasn't what I wanted it to be. I went to France and magically the food and the table cured me of all my ills. Like that's been done too many times. It's tired and it's really not believable anymore. So I felt like I needed to be in some sense a slightly comical character. And go through a series of failures and of inabilities to live up to my vision for myself as part of coming out the other end, a wiser, more humble person, but also I think a person by the end of the book who understands what's important and what's not. And the food journey really in this book takes a similar path to my personal journey, which is I start off trying to cook French, quote unquote, which in my mind means complicated, performative, haute cuisine, restaurant food. Mm-hmm. And over the course of this sort of humbling path that I take, what I end up loving about food and cooking by the end is cooking what my family loves for these very specific people that I love, that I want to love what the food I put in front of them. But also by extension, they're going to be more likely to love this place that I love if I'm not cooking at them as opposed to cooking for them.
This episode is supported by HRN business member Gustiamo, the place to buy the best Italian food online. Gustiamo imports the most authentic food from Italian farmers and food makers dedicated to their food and traditions. Make Gustiamo your online store for ingredients and pantry staples from Italy. Visit GUSTIAMO.com. Gustiamo supports HRN's creative educational reporting and storytelling that drive conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place.
So I know that I like that your bio describes you as a tax preparer and writer, and then at the very beginning of the book, you talk about your career in tax preparation, and that was a practical decision. But I know that you've written for the Washington Post and Food and Wine and lots of other publications. Had you been writing all along, or was that something that you came to later?
Not at all. I mean, I grew up revering authors and writers. I was a bookworm, a sort of slightly anxiety prone introvert bookworm as a child, and so I was immersed in books and writing and turns of phrase, and that really got me fired up. It was I loved it as much as sports. Really, it really got me excited the way that words could make me feel things. And then I ended up studying languages and literature in college. It was a French, ancient Greek, and English major in college, but that gave me, zero marketable skills. Nobody wanted to hire me to walk the streets of Paris and write perceptive takes on, Shakespeare's Hamlet. So I needed to spend a certain amount of the middle of my life just earning a living. And this trip, what happened in this trip is that I started journaling. And it rekindled that earlier love. It was a rediscovery of that earlier love of writing and words, and in some sense was the beginning of the book, because I was trying to capture what was happening to us during this extraordinary stretch of time, and that required me to put things into scenes and make them interesting and have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and try to conclude something from the episodes that our family had when we went to the butcher, when we went to visit the goat farm where they made the fresh goat cheese that we'd have that night. And so it was that really led to taking writing seriously again in midlife. But it was new in that sense that I hadn't done it for many years, but it was also not new in that I was revisiting an early version of myself, not just starting fresh.
And the book is so from the very beginning, it's very vulnerable, and I feel like you had to open up and be able to talk about like your relationship with your wife and the disappointments that you've had with yourself and your kids rolling their eyes at you and all that stuff. Was this the first piece of writing where you were really open and vulnerable like that?
Very much so. In fact, it was part of the process of the book, and part of why it took so long to write was that came so late. The kind of writing that I loved was a beautiful, sparkling surface with lots of wordplay and lots of figurative language, and writers like Fitzgerald and Nabokov and J.D. Salinger. That was the kind of writing that I loved, and once again, the process of writing the book really was also a process of shedding that urge to perform and to be sort of invulnerable on the page, to have my prose be so beautiful that nobody would question whether I was telling a good story. And I got to a point where a coach said, essentially, Steve, you're a very good writer, but nobody cares. They don't care about how prettily you describe the apricot if they don't care who you are and don't care about what you're going through. And so that part of the book came very late, but I feel like it was a critical part of turning it from a light, charming romp through southern France into what I feel you're sensing, which is that by the end, I think it turned into actually a rich memoir and a meditation on some of what we all deal with when we're in midlife as people with families.
Yeah. And so, and I totally got that, like from page one for sure. And very relatable in that sense. And I think it's sort of a way of starting the book where you're like suddenly in this situation where your whole family is kind of skeptical and unhappy, and you're trying to, keep them happy and focused on how much fun and how much learning.
Right. And I have an agenda at that point because I'm coming at it as a lifelong Francophile who wants everybody to fall in love with France so that I can go to France more often. And so I had to get past that as well.
And so how did you get connected with Francis Lam, who ends up being your editor, right?
Correct. So that's an interesting story. I was writing the book again for a number of years, was also doing some food writing for, publications, newspapers and magazines. And then, and with zero success, I was querying agents. I was sending manuscripts out. I was talking to editors. I was hiring coaches. It wasn't working. And in part, I realize now that it was because the book wasn't fully conceived yet. I hadn't gotten to that point where I turned it into a story, into a true memoir. but it was frustrating. However, then in 2019, I won the James Beard Award for an article I wrote about Northern food, about actually food of, not of France, but of the Great Lakes North. And it was at the James Beard ceremony in New York City where I met Francis, who had admired the piece that I'd written. And as we were standing there, he said, "Do you have an agent?" I said, "No, I would, give my left arm for an agent." He said, "Well, that guy that just walked past us, that guy should be your agent." And so in a matter of 15 minutes, I went from several years of failing to have anybody be interested in my book to meeting Francis, who would become my editor, and then meeting David Black, who would become my agent. But that's how we met. He had liked the article. We'd kind of known of each other. We were in similar circles, but had not really crossed paths. And then from that moment forward, we've been working together and have since become, quasi friends, I would say. We live too far apart to be true, spend every day together friends, but I consider him a friend. And the work that he did on the manuscript was really, really great work. I mean, he had to rein me in. I'm a wordy guy. He had to get it down to the right word count, but he was just so smart and perceptive about what needed to stay and what needed to go. And he understood both the food part and the personal family part, and was able to let me know when I'd gone too far in a particular direction, and was a very, very wise and brilliant editor. I have nothing but gratitude for him.
That's really cool. That's great to hear. So what did you learn about food from this, from the book? Well, maybe from the writing of the book, but also the time that you spent there.
It's a great question. Certainly there was a certain element of eating local and sustainable. I mean, that's sort of everywhere. And Mediterranean France is a place where that's easy to do because the growing season is long, because it's, there's an infrastructure there that has people eating a broad array of things. So certainly I learned what it was like to eat from within a very small radius.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Beyond that, I think really what I learned was that food is about place, and that there is still something thrilling about food, which is that it's one of the few remaining things other than industrialized food, obviously corporate, the kind of food that you can get in any small town anywhere in America. But being in a wine growing region, really teaches you that there are still places in the world that can do things that can't be done in other places of the world. And in my case, with the food and wine there, that food and wine can happen because we're at that latitude and we're that proximity to the sea, with these particular hills behind us. And those, hills allow us to dry the charcuterie in a particular way. The sea provides fresh fish and seafood. And the amount of sunshine that falls on that part of the world allows grapes to mature to a particular degree that allows us to make that particular kind of wine. I think that was really thrilling, and it was not just thrilling in a way that made me want to keep going back there, which is true, but it was also a way of then rediscovering food from my home place, the Minnesota and the North, because the principles are the same. It's just that the flavors and the ingredients are different, and the preservation methods are different. Instead of drying would make much more sense in the Mediterranean. Here, it has to be preserving, fermenting, pickling to get food, to push food through a very long cold season, a very long, non-growing season. But I think ultimately that would be my answer. It was a thrill to know that I'm having this right here, and to some extent, nobody else in the world could be having this thing right here because I'm here and not somewhere else. It's
really helpful. Thanks. You're from Minnesota, and you're in Minnesota now. I'm from Ohio originally. So as Midwesterners, it's one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this is do you think that people who in Minnesota and who might not ever go to France or even think about France are reading this book and thinking about it differently, or is it going to or is it being read by, the Francis Lambs of the world and the food kind of experts? Do you think that the way you're telling the story kind of will get through and maybe teach some people who might not otherwise read a book like this?
I think so. That's the feedback I'm getting anyway, is that people like being in this world, whether or not they would ever want to inhabit the world. The fact that it's drawn with a lot of detail, that it's very immersive, that you're still you're still among people and characters that you end up caring about a lot, and you want to understand what their fate is going to be and how their relationships are going to come to some kind of fruition. So I didn't ever think of it as like an advocacy piece where like I'm saying you should go to Southern France. I don't know that I even really believe that. I think, in fact, one of the other lessons I would say I learned from this experience and from writing the book is that, it wasn't a particularly special place. It was just a tiny little 800-person village. It was a dot on a map that we just happened to find. And we discovered all this richness there. And it has reminded me that I think, to some extent, I think there's an expectation that travel, broad travel, is deeply enriching. And I found increasingly that that's not the case, that a lot of travel to a lot of different places there's a shallowness about it, about what you can perceive, about what you can absorb, about the relationships that you make. And so this was really, in some sense, an argument for going fewer places and staying there longer, and understanding that there's a great amount of richness by digging deep into a particular place that is irreproducible, that you can't get by visiting world capitals and by seeing sites that millions of other people have already seen and photographed and talked about. And even if you think they're terrific, what you have to say over the course of a week's visit is never going to be interesting compared to a conversation with somebody who's inhabited a particular place on Earth for most of their life. They have, if they've lived in an engaged way, that person. The example would be my next door neighbor, Jean-Luc, in this story, in this village, who literally is living in the house that he grew up in, has never seen Paris and doesn't own a computer, but is one of the most wisest and most interesting people I've ever met, because he's lived with an open-eyed, engaged, interested, wondering mindset for his entire life in one place on Earth. And I could talk to him for weeks at a time, and I could be bored silly, on minute 3 of what somebody did in their trip to Bangkok.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So my last question, selfishly as a parent, I'm just curious, what did you learn about parenting from this, and what would you say? How do you look at parenting differently after this trip?
Well, I would say our kids were resistant to this. I would say that my biggest lesson about parenting that I think got instigated a little bit by this trip, but that I believe more and more and more, is that parenting is about being there. That part of why this trip worked is that we were physically present. We were not off doing our things. There was a lot of family time. There was a lot of time at home, both parents there. And I've discovered, our kids are now 21 and 26. We're still pretty close. Things are good. I'm very, very grateful for that. But I think it helped me understand the extent to which it's very, very hard to bond with kids between 6 p.m. and bedtime. That there is an element of having to be there, because the kids may not be ready to bond between 6 and 8. The kids are ready to make those connections when they're ready. And if you're not there, you're going to miss it. And so you have to be there a lot. And there has to be a lot of sort of boring downtime, and a lot of time just sitting in their presence and going to events that you don't necessarily love, but it's, that moment when you're driving to school and the kids in the back seat and they suddenly open up like a blossom, and you are suddenly more deeply connected to that kid. That can only happen by having a lot of time together. And I think this was a practice run for being together a lot, and then letting that relationship evolve on its own terms, rather than trying to impose it because you're so busy.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for that. That's great. Well, I will tell everyone this is I've had a good time reading this. It's called A Season for That. We'll put the link in the show notes to where you can get the book. But Steve, I hope we can talk again soon, and I appreciate you taking the time. It's been fun to chat.
Thank you, and I love what you do. This is a great project you're in the middle of. I really admire it.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you all. Check out A Season for That. We'll put the link in the show notes, and we'll see you next week.
Sounds great. Thank you.